welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. The response to the follow-up questions about the new Loos British Cemetery extension have been very positive and have prompted a few more questions. And I think that is a subject that I'm sure we will return to on a regular basis. Since I was there last month, there have been some additional burials, and I've discovered some additional information as to how that cemetery might develop. So as this is kind of putting the Great War in the news again, then obviously this is something that we're going to look at on a regular basis. And I think as we move from this year into the next, and I would guess that hospital project at Lons that has resulted in the discovery of a large number of human remains that has then led to the creation of this new cemetery, we're also going to see, I think, the first major phase of the Canal du Nord construction. And who knows what kind of stories and what kind of news we're going to see coming out of that. So that's one that we're going to return to. But also, the Battle of Loos seems to have played very heavily in the Old Front Line podcast calendar of late. I was over at Loos just a few weeks ago, walking that ground again, and I did a podcast supporters evening talk on the Battle of Loos and the battlefields as they are today, which is now available on the Old Front Line YouTube channel. And if you don't subscribe to that, go and check it out. And there's quite a lot of new material on there covering Loos and Verdun most recently. So it's no kind of surprise that one of the next batch of questions in our questions and answer episodes relates indeed to the Battle of Loos. It is a battle that has fascinated me for a long time. I hope to write about it a little bit further down the line. But for now, let's get down to our question. This comes from Stephen Hunt, big supporter of the podcast, regularly sends in questions, always interesting ones, who sent this in via email. And Stephen says, I have seen a couple of references online stating that the losses on the first day of the Battle of Loos were in proportionate terms higher than the losses on the first day of the Somme. Is this correct? And if so, what are the figures to support this? Well, in terms of just the first day of the Battle of Loos itself, the 25th of September 1915, the official history states that 470 officers and 15,000 other ranks became casualties on that day. So that is obviously nowhere near the 57,000 casualties that were suffered by the British Army and Commonwealth forces on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. But that's not what we're kind of talking about here. We're not talking about were there more casualties on the first day of Loos than on the first day of the Somme. We know that's not true because the 1st of July 1916 is the British Army's Black Day, blackest day of not just the First World War but in its entire history. But it's this idea of kind of proportional casualties, and were there battalions and brigades and divisions that suffered just as much as the first day of the Battle of the Somme, if not more. And that's where, once we kind of delve into the figures, we do see some evidence of that. But if we go back to the Somme, or go forward to the Somme, depending on how we look at this, and think of Martin Middlebrook's absolutely classic First Day of the Somme book, and this kind of interest in casualty statistics by individual battalion comes from there, I think, because he lists a whole load of units that suffered more than 500 casualties on the first day of the Somme, which gives us the kind of top tier of casualties suffered by individual units in that assault. And if we look at a similar kind of thing for Loos, and some years ago, I went right through the official history and war diaries and did this, but that particular research is tucked away in the depths of the Old Front Line archives. I can't find it. So a quick delve into the official history, and the 1915 volume 2, which covers the Battle of Loos, is, in my mind, a particularly good volume of the official history, with excellent maps, but also a lot of really good detail that helps you to understand what happened and also pick apart issues like this in terms of casualties. So if we look at some of the units involved in that first day attack, what we find is that in the kind of middle part of the battlefield, where the ground was particularly open and there was absolutely no cover whatsoever, then we do find some quite extensive casualties there, but not as many individual units that suffer this kind of cut-off point of more than 500 casualties. Lots in the kind of 300 and 400 kind of level. And if you look at the number of men that went over the top in some of those units, that if we start to talk about percentages without delving into statistics too much, in some cases those were pretty high percentages of the number of men that went over became casualties on that day. But in the first division, which was not far from the Lone Tree, for example, at Loos, there was only one battalion in that division that suffered over 500 casualties. That was the 8th Battalion, the Royal Berkshire Regiment, and in fact their figure was 493, so they were the one that was kind of nearest to that 500 figure. In the neighbouring 7th Division, the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, they went over the top, 17 officers and 650 men, and only 140 walked away from that battle. So that was a really kind of catastrophic attack with over 500 casualties in that unit. But where you see some of the heaviest casualties on the first day of the Battle of Loos is in the fight for the Hohenzollern Redoubt, where the 9th Scottish Division, that first Kitchener's Army, new army division to be formed in 1914, the kind of tip of the spear of what was called the first 100,000 volunteers, that goes into action against this German defensive position named after the German royal family, the Hohenzollern Redoubt. And in that attack, it loses a staggering amount of casualties. It loses its divisional commander, Major General Thesiger, who is killed. His body is never found. He disappears in the fighting in the Hohenzollern Redoubt, and it loses a large number of battalion commanders as well, which is why Thesiger went forward to try and find out what was going on. But in that division, there were 6 battalions that suffered over 500 casualties, with the highest casualty rate being the 7th Battalion Cameron Highlanders, who lost 20 officers and 700 men. Now that is higher than the casualty rate for the Newfoundland Regiment on the first day of the Somme and the 10th Battalion, the West Yorkshire Regiment, on the same day down at Fricourt. So this is where we start to see some of these casualties being a kind of warning to what would happen later on the Somme the following year. But as we work our way through the battle, it's not just the first day. In fact, one of the worst days was on the 26th of September 1915, the second day of the Battle of Loos, when the 21st and the 24th Divisions made this attack over that central ground, over that open ground, into that bit of the German defences, where there's this kind of U-shaped trench system with what were called Stützpunkts, which were German defensive positions with machine guns and access to artillery and mortars. And these units moved into that open ground, into that kind of U-shaped position where the Germans could fire at them from a number of different angles, and they got absolutely annihilated in the fighting there. The 2 divisions that went over the top, the 21st and the 24th, into that attack, suffered over 4,000 casualties each on that day, with the 8th Buffs losing 24 officers and 534 men, and the 8th Royal West Kents, 24 officers and 556 men. So a very bad day for Kent. And this kind of gives us a bit of an insight into just how costly these battles of 1915 were. So what we see is that this is not higher than the losses on the first day of the Somme. I mean, there are battalions here that do suffer higher casualty rates than some of those units, but in terms of the overall picture with the number of men involved, the number of brigades and divisions, then it's comparative in some areas and not quite as heavy casualties in others. So the comparison between Loos and the Somme is probably not that useful here, really. But what we see with the Battle of Loos and these heavy casualties is the army begin to change its way of doing things. This left out of battle idea that develops from this, where entire units are sent in, all of the officers and all of the men with no reserves. They suffer catastrophic losses, and there's virtually no one left to reform these units, leading in the case of the 9th Scottish Division to several battalions being disbanded. So by the time of the Somme, you see the army changing, and they take this 10% of the unit, which are LOB, left out of battle, and they are the ones that are there in reserve to reform the unit if it gets destroyed. And of course, as we move from the big push of 1915 at Loos to the even bigger push on the Somme in 1916, there is the hope that this is the battle-winning, war-winning offensive that will bring the war to a conclusion. But sadly, as we now know from the history of the Battle of the Somme, Loos was only the start of these battles where casualties like this would be suffered on this kind of scale. So loss and casualties, important part of our understanding, and particularly when we look at it to see what the percentages of men that were going into action were out of a unit, and then what the percentage of them became casualties in the fighting, and that gives us an idea as to really how these units were truly affected by these kind of attacks. So a really good question, Stephen, and I hope that's answered it for you. Moving on to question number 2. This comes from Geordie Nash on email, and they ask, I was wondering how many of the newly formed units formed after 1914 continued forward as official units and fought in the Second World War, for instance, units of the York and Lancaster or Greenhowards, etc. Well, in terms of individual regiments, during the war, when the war began in 1914, the average regiment had 3 regular battalions, the 1st and the 2nd on active service, the 3rd a home service kind of reserve unit supplying reinforcements and drafts to the other 2 battalions that were sometimes in the far-flung corners of the Empire. Then they would have a number of territorial battalions, normally a 4th, 5th, 6th battalion, and they would be part-time Saturday night soldiers. Now, some regiments were bigger than this, some smaller, and of course there were territorial regiments like the Cambridgeshire Regiment and the London Regiment and the Hertfordshire Regiment that formed their own kind of mini units. When the war came along, those regiments then formed additional battalions. For the new army, these became known as service battalions, units formed for wartime service only. And when the conflict was over, if they hadn't already been disbanded, then all of those began to cease to exist in late 1918 or on into 1919. In most cases, it was that year that these service battalions were disbanded. Some of them in Europe, France, Belgium, by then in the Army of the Rhine in Cologne, and then these units would be disbanded and the nucleus of personnel sent home and demobilised. So in that case, most of those did not survive on into the Second World War. The territorial battalions remained, and of course the regular ones did, and all of those went on to serve in World War II. And in particular, a lot of the territorial units kept names that were then perpetuated a generation later. So you mentioned the York and Lancs. The 4th Battalion was known as the Hallamshire Battalion in the First World War, and that became its own territorial battalion by World War II. And it fought with the West Riding Division, and later on in the Normandy and Northwest Europe campaign of 1944-45, over the years of guiding groups to Normandy, taking veterans there. I've taken quite a few Hallamshire veterans back to a place called Tessel Wood, for example, which is near the village of Fontenay-le-Pesnel, where they suffered some of their highest casualties in the Normandy campaign. So that's a unit that kind of continued on. In terms of wartime raised units, you have things like the Machine Gun Corps, the Army Cyclist Corps, and the Labour Corps. These are formed during the war. And in the case of the Machine Gun Corps, that survived a little bit after the First World War, but then it was disbanded in the 1920s, and instead they took entire regiments, like the Middlesex Regiment, for example, and the Northumberland Fusiliers, and these became machine gun regiments. Basically, the battalions within them were machine gun battalions. When the next army went to war in 1939, that's how heavy machine guns and support weapons like mortars were used within these battalions of regiments like the Middlesex and the Northumberland Fusiliers. The Army Cyclist Corps was a unit that was unique to the First World War, but the Labour Corps eventually became the Pioneer Corps, and that was a unit that was then perpetuated into the next conflict. And the Pioneer Corps did a lot of important work in the 1940 campaign. If you look at some of the casualties on the Dunkirk Memorial, for example, Pioneer Corps is particularly noticeable there. And on D-Day, Pioneer Corps men were landed in the follow-up waves on the D-Day beaches to do the vital kind of engineering and labour work to construct roadways off of the beaches and inland, and then they did all kinds of work throughout the rest of the 1944-45 Northwest Europe campaign. So out of those wartime raised units, really it's only the Labour Corps that goes on to be of any significance within the British Army a generation later. In terms of individual battalions, there were some that were formed in the First World War that then continued. Some of the Kitchener's Army battalions became territorial battalions in the interwar period, so they survived. The London Regiment that we spoke about, many of their battalions survived, not all of them. Quite a lot were disbanded in the interwar period. But one that kind of particularly comes to mind to me is the 9th Battalion King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, which I've done a lot of research on them on the Somme, where I've got a group photograph of the officers, and they had that famous toast when the barrage lifts before they went into the attack at Fricourt on the 1st of July. And then many years later, after I'd researched that, I was over at Anzio following my father's war on the ground there. He served at Anzio with the gunners, and in the Anzio beachhead and the Anzio War Cemetery there, I came across the graves of men of the 9th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, a unit that served at Anzio. So that's kind of parallel of existence between the First and the Second World War for a unit that was originally formed through that new army, through that Kitchener's Army in 1914, and was still fighting 30 years later at Anzio in 1944. And I'm sure there are quite a few other examples of that. But I think the kind of general essence behind your question, was there a kind of continuity between the first and the second? There was. And in terms of units formed out of the kind of genesis and the circumstances of the First World War, did some go on? Well, some did and some didn't. The Army Cyclist Corps is a good example of that. Really useful in the First World War with units that had their own transport, bicycles that could then be moved in the area behind the front to do all kinds of lines of communication kind of work. But then a generation later with the BEF in 1940, it was a highly mechanised organisation, in fact the most mechanised British Army in history up to that point, and it didn't need a unit like the Army Cyclist Corps, even if that had existed within the order of battle of the British Army, which it didn't by that stage. So a really interesting question, Geordie, and I hope that's given you some food for thought and possibly lead you down a few avenues to do a bit of research into finding some of these units that continue between the two great conflicts. Question number 3 comes from Christopher Chandler on email. This question came to me after listening to the Q&A about the 1914 Star and your discussion of how soldiers eligible for the Star would often claim the class when they weren't entitled to wear it. So my question is about the so-called stolen valour, as we call it here in America. Maybe this isn't common in the UK, but in the US we periodically have items in the news about a prominent person who claims to have been awarded a medal that he didn't actually receive, or to have had a particular combat experience he didn't actually have. So my question is whether you are aware of any instances of this phenomena in the British and Commonwealth Empire veterans of the Great War. Well, I think men have been exaggerating their experience and their role in conflict ever since conflict existed. And we know that some men do jobs that are nearer the front than others, and there's perhaps more perceived glory in the frontline PBI, poor bloody infantry, than there is, for example, for a man who worked in the field bakery at Rouen during the First World War. And I remember one of the veterans saying to me that when they were on the battlefield, he was an infantry soldier, they would pick up souvenirs, Lugers and Iron Crosses and bayonets and pickelhaubers, and when they got away from the battlefield into rest areas behind the lines, there would be a lot of these guys that were in rear echelon units that would pay top money for this kind of gear so that they could go back home and say, I took this Iron Cross off the Kaiser, and I took this bayonet out of the hands of a dead German general, or, kind of whatever the story would be. So that kind of exaggeration certainly did go on, and I'm sure it goes on in combat in every war in the past and every war right up to current times. But that's kind of not really what you're talking about here. Were there men who wore medals they weren't entitled to? Well, I'm sure that there were. In fact, I've read newspaper articles in that early kind of period, in the interim between the issuing of ribbons before the actual medals came out. You come across examples of men who are just able to wear a ribbon to really kind of increase their status as a veteran, with gallantry ribbons, or the 1914 Star ribbon, which, of course, the Mons Star already, when that came in 1917, by the end of the war, it was already the most famous campaign medal of the Great War. And I guess kind of everyone wanted to have it to give them the status of an old contemptible, an old sweat who'd been there since the very beginning. So there are newspaper reports in which men fraudulently wear ribbons, and once some medals were available, managed to get hold of perhaps blank ones, or they buy medals from an actual veteran. You'll be surprised how many soldiers just sold their medals when they got back, even gallantry medals. And they're using these gongs to give themselves glory that they're not entitled to, or to use that status associated with them in some kind of fraudulent way. But when I go back to the veterans I interviewed in the 1980s, I never really encountered any of them that did anything like this, or that exaggerated their experiences, with a couple of exceptions. There was a gunner who told me a story about he'd been chosen for a firing squad. I'm pretty sure I've told this in the podcast before. He said he'd been chosen for a firing squad. The man they were going to shoot was a major in the Army Service Corps who hated the war and had made that very vocal to everyone around him, including his men. War Office couldn't have it, so they decided to shoot him to shut him up. And this guy had been selected for the firing squad and was going to shoot him. So I was very interested to hear this story, because I was interested in military discipline, and I was pretty sure that this wasn't correct. But I kind of let him play it out. So I said, and what happened then? Did you take part in the firing squad? Oh, no, he said, I was very lucky. I was gassed the night before, so I didn't have to take part. So I think rather than him deliberately lying, I think what that was is evidence of what I've referred to in this podcast before as estaminet stories, where soldiers have got food and drink in their belly and they're telling all kinds of tales to each other based on whispers they've heard when they've been in and out of the line. Because there was a lot of speculation, there was a lot of gossip. Soldiers liked to believe some of it, dismissed others, but this kind of thing spread around men in and around the battlefield area. And that is not really lying, it's kind of believing some of the stories that were told at the time. And I think what he was relating to me was one of those that he kind of extrapolated over the years to make it something much bigger than it actually was. So there was a few examples of that, but I never met a veteran who had medals, and in fact many of them would not really ever want to get their medals out. Some of them, their medals were still in their boxes. They'd never worn them. They'd never even put the ribbons onto them. They were not interested in their medals. And they were quite surprised when I asked them, said, can I have a look at your medals? And I remember Malcolm Vivian, when I went to see him, he had the Military Cross, and he had the British War and Victory Medal, and he had his Second World War medals. And he saw me looking at his 2 First World War medals. I was tipping them up on the side and reading the rims. He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm just looking at the rims, see what's engraved on there. He said, oh, they're blank. I said, no, it's got your name on there and your rank. And he didn't even realise that. So they didn't perhaps always place the emphasis on their medals that we maybe think that they did. So I never encountered any veterans that I was aware of who were wearing medals that they weren't entitled to. But after one had died, who I didn't know, but a friend of mine knew, he was approached by the family to do some more research, and he asked me if I could help. And this veteran had served in a London-based regiment and had been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his bravery. And the family had the DCM, and they had his other campaign medals, and he'd wore them throughout their known life and was very proud of them and would show them to people. and he'd actually been, from memory, a very early member of the Western Front Association and had spoken to the group in his area about his experiences. So they came to me with the details. I looked it up. He certainly had served, and he was entitled to the British War and Victory Medal, and the information on those was correct. But I searched, and I went through diaries, and I went through the London Gazette, and I went through everything else. He had never been awarded the DCM. And when I finally got to see these medals, you could see very clearly that the DCM had been re-engraved. It had been milled down around the edge, and then his details had been added to it. Now, I don't want to disparage that man. I don't want to condemn him in any kind of way. Who knows what led him to that point? Who knows what circumstances made him do that? And I think, to me, it's a fascinating story in its own right as to why someone would do that and perpetuate that, not just for a short while, but for most of his life. And as you can understand, the family were very upset by this. But I tried to relay through my friend, and I'm pretty sure that he did. You kind of got to see this in the context of the time. And he had served. He'd been in some of the most important final battles of the Great War on the Western Front, which is something not to be sniffed at in any shape or form. So with that Great War generation, it was a lot less common, certainly in my experience. What I have found is that kind of approach and that kind of deception and weaving your way through the truth of a soldier's service is something that was much more common with veterans of the Second World War. And it kind of goes back to those rear echelon base wallah troops, as the soldiers called them during the Great War, who were in the field bakeries at Rouen or whatever it was, desperate for souvenirs to prove that they'd done something in the war. When you look at the British Army in the Second World War, it's a much smaller army, and a much smaller number of its men are actually at the tip of the spear on the battlefield fighting the enemy. There are far more men in support units. And I've found that those are the ones that weave all kinds of stories when you let them, or you're in a situation where they're able to do that. So having done battlefield tours with veterans, I remember quite a few. A guy in a petrol company, Royal Army Service Corps, doing a vital job, delivering the fuel to the frontline area for tanks and vehicles and everything else. He would kind of tell tall stories as to how he'd driven a petrol lorry into the side of a Tiger tank and knocked it out, things like this. So that was much more common with the World War II generation. And I remember, again, being with a group of very kind of vocal guys that were in support units, with one or two men who'd been in the infantry, kind of rolling their eyes at some of the stories they were hearing from these guys. Now, I never encountered that with First World War veterans, and I think it reflects the changing nature of the British Army between those two conflicts. And I'm sure there is a whole podcast. I mean, I've done some podcasts on veterans and how that whole thing with memory works and what is the value of oral history. And you could do a really interesting, fascinating comparative one with, I guess, the Second World War generation. But that's for another podcast, another day. But thank you, Christopher, for that really interesting question. I mean, you are from the United States of America. What I don't know is what kind of experience of that there was with veterans returning from the American Expeditionary Force, where again there was a very high proportion of men who were in support units, who weren't in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, weren't fighting right up to the last second along the Meuse River. So anyone out there with some knowledge on this, I'd love to hear more. So great question. Thanks for that. So let's move on to our fourth and final question, once more on email, and that comes from Adam Bootle. Adam asks, what advice would you give to someone wishing to own something related to the Great War? I've seen reproduction Princess Mary tins on an online auction site. Are there any other items commonly reproduced or even faked? I've recently bought a memorial plaque and took my time to research the item and buy a plaque named to a unique individual rather than a John Smith. Are there any other entry-level items which you would recommend to a new collector? Well, as I often say on this podcast, I've collected Great War material for as long as I've been interested in it. And of course, when I started in the 80s, there was tons of this stuff, and there were tons of junk shops and junk markets and boot sales where you could go and you could find great war material because no one really wanted it, and it was really cheap. Virtually nothing was faked at all. A few bits of really rare kind of uniform related kit, but the general stuff, certainly Princess Mary's tins, that was never ever faked. But I have seen huge fake numbers of those over the last few years. I remember in the shell hole shop at Ypres, John there bought an entire collection, I think Russian made Princess Mary tins. And Peter Doyle, we've done a podcast on the Princess Mary tin with Peter Doyle, who has written a book on this, spoke about some of the reproductions as well. I'm pretty sure, if not in that podcast, certainly in his book. So there are some fakes out there. It's pretty rare. I mean, certain objects like the Princess Mary's tin can obviously be faked. And I'm pretty sure there's quite a lot of fake whistles out there where they're standard police whistles where they may have added a date to it, simply because I've seen so many, particularly 1916 ones. And that doesn't mean that every 1916 whistle out there, if you've got one sitting on your shelf, is a fake. But I'm guessing that probably if you kind of look at the way the thing is engraved or milled, then you're going to see kind of obvious signs of that. And probably you wouldn't have bought it if you saw that in the first place. But let's put fakes to one side, because just about everything, I guess, is faked one way or another. Certain things can't easily be faked, like memorial plaques, and you picked up one, and that's a good kind of entry point into the First World War. If you shop around online or at military affairs or at antiques fairs, you can get one at a reasonable price to a unique casualty that then connects you to an individual on the battlefield. And we've had a whole podcast about the memorial plaque, and you can kind of find out more about that there. But the 1914 tin, the Princess Mary's tin, is a good object to have. Look for ones that are obviously aged, have got a good patina on them, that kind of phrase of antique shows on the television over many years. And look for ones where some of the original content is in there. But that in itself also, of course, has been faked in recent years as well. But just the tin itself is a really evocative kind of item of that early period of the war. I'm looking across onto my bookshelves, and I've got one sitting on there that belonged to a soldier in the Essex Regiment, for example. So it's kind of a nice object that connects us to the First World War. And that is, to me, the purpose of having tactile objects like this, because it's not just about owning the thing, and certainly for me, not the value of the thing. It's how it connects us to the history of the Great War. But if you're going to look at memorial plaques, as you have done, then single medals is a kind of another way of doing it. Single medals can be cheap. Medal groups get split up. They get split up between a family. They get split up when people die. And also in the 70s, when the price of silver went through the roof, huge number of British war medals were melted down. So there are tons and tons of single victory medals out there with no other medal left to go with it. But there are the stars, 1914, the Mons Star, 1914-15 star, and you can, as individual medals, you can buy those much cheaper than a complete medal group. So if you were looking for a medal to a casualty buried in a cemetery that interests you, or from a battlefield that you feel particularly connected to, that is one way of doing it, to look for those single medals. And all of the British medals and Commonwealth, Empire as it was then, medals from the First World War are all named. Now, there have been examples of those being renamed, but that's much less common. And buy from a reputable dealer. I'm not going to kind of name any, but there are some really good ones out there. Type in British medal dealer and you'll find some really good ones that have been established for a very, very long time. And that's a kind of way into connecting, again, yourself to an individual soldier who served. And you don't have to just buy casualties. You can buy medals to particular units of men that survived the war and find out more about them too. But if it's casualties that you're interested in, I think it is nice to have some kind of object that connects you to a grave or a name on a memorial to the missing, or a cemetery somewhere out there on the battlefields. Then we've got memorial plaques, and I haven't done an episode on this yet, but there is the memorial scroll that was produced, this beautifully printed scroll with the soldier's name, handwritten in a calligraphy style at the bottom. It's done by art students from London, and that has the soldier's rank and his name and his regiment. So they're much, unlike the memorial plaques where it's just a name, that's much easier to kind of trace an individual, because you've got a regiment to go with as well. And they can be found very cheaply indeed because they're paper items. It's quite nice to look for them in their original tubes, rolled up in there, perhaps with a letter from the king, and on the tube will be the address of the next of kin that the scroll was sent to. And I think like memorial plaques, they're incredibly beautiful objects, impressive and powerful objects to have that connect us once more to an individual soldier. And also postcards. I mean, postcards is a subject in its own right. The late Tony Holt and his wife Valmai published a whole series of books on picture postcards of the First World War, and that's quite good to give you an idea of what was out there really during that period. Now, some of these can be expensive, some of the really rare kind of printed cards and some from certain artists, but, there were millions of men in the army, and most of them went to a photographic studio and had their photo taken. So if you're interested in a particular regiment or a particular period of the war, you can delve into portrait and group photographs from that period and build up a really nice collection. Unit focused, theatre of war focused, because there were photographic studios in Egypt for the troops that were in Palestine, for example, so you can kind of look out for men in khaki drill and shorts. There was photographic studios in Salonika and Italy, so you've got quite a choice, and you could build up a really fascinating collection of these without spending too much money, but getting a huge amount from it, learning about uniforms, learning about the badges, identifying the units that you see depicted in the photographs that you pick up. It's kind of a bit of social history as well as the military history, and many of them are written on the back with messages, sometimes the name of the soldier, and then you can research that soldier and find out more about him. So picture postcards, look for those. And I know I say this every time one of these interesting questions comes up, but there could be another podcast episode in this collectables of the Great War, and maybe that's one we'll have either towards the end of this season or the beginning of the next. So thanks for that, Adam. Good luck with your collecting. Let me know how you get on. So thanks for another round of fascinating questions. I hope you've enjoyed the answers. You can send them in as usual via email or via the Discord server, and I look forward to answering some more questions next time on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.